Mohnish Pabrai just released his brand new investing framework. Let's check it out. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is CJ and I'm a software engineer and investor based in Chicago. And today I want to talk about Mohnish Pabrai's new original investment insight, which is the concept of spawners. I'll cover Pabrai's new spawner framework, different categories of spawners, and finally some of Mohnish's rules and tips for investing in spawners. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel if you find this information useful. Remember, this is not investment advice. There will be timestamps in the description below if you want to jump around to any section of this video. Okay, let's dig into it. Pabrai recently gave a talk to the students of Peking University back in December of 2020. The main topic of this session was his new investing framework, which is a classification of businesses called spawners. A spawner is a company that, at its core, within its DNA, relentlessly adds and incubates new businesses that have the potential for massive growth in the future. Failure is also a fundamental and even expected part of this game. For instance, Amazon released the Fire Phone. Oh, you don't remember that product? Well, that was because it was a complete failure. But it really didn't matter. Amazon had so many irons in the fire that ended up growing exponentially. After all, a spawner can grow massively by making a few small asymmetric bets that can have potentially huge upsides. It's interesting that Pabrai describes this trait as biological and at the cellular level of the company. We can think of a company as a living, ever-changing organism, and spawning has to be ingrained in the company culture, leadership, and employees for it to work. There are some benefits to being a spawner. Firstly, spawning can extend the lifespan of businesses if executed effectively, because as we know, businesses, even great ones, don't last forever. Secondly, there's a massive tax benefit for spawners. These companies can actually reduce their reportable income by investing in these new business ventures, which in turn will reduce the amount of taxable income. Pabrai describes this as a tax-free loan from the government. For instance, Amazon would have multiples of their current reported net income if they weren't investing all of their free cash flow into new business ventures. However, keep in mind that most companies are not spawners. Spawners are a rare breed. Companies like McDonald's and Ford focus solely on their core business. Pabrai calls these types of companies focused mousetraps. He gave the example of how McDonald's divested its interest in Chipotle way too early, and Ford sold off both Land Rover and Jaguar, all in the name of focusing on their core business. But looking back, we can see that these were obviously adjacent related businesses, and of course the companies have performed very well to this day, but if they had leaned a little more into this spawner framework, they probably would be in a lot better position right now. But this was probably inevitable because, like we said earlier, spawning has to be within the DNA of the company. Okay, so now that we understand the concept of spawners, let's talk about the different categories of spawners that Mohnish has come up with. According to Mohnish, there are 5 different categories of spawners. Adjacent spawners are companies that start to create businesses within related fields to their core business. For example, we can look at Amazon in its early days. The company started with selling books online and slowly expanded their offerings to other categories without too much infrastructure change to the core business. Next, we have embryonic spawners. These spawners acquire other businesses and help them grow even larger. For me, the most obvious examples of embryonic spawners would be Facebook with its acquisition of Instagram and WhatsApp, and even more prominently, we have Google with their acquisition of YouTube, Android, and the company behind Google Maps. Now, it's possible that all of these purchased companies could have grown and been very successful on their own, but we can see that there's something within the DNA of both Facebook and Google that have helped these companies grow into something more successful. Up next, we have cloner spawners. Pabrai is famous for his investment philosophy of cloning other investors, so this idea is probably a no-brainer for him. Basically, cloner spawners copy successful products from other companies. Microsoft immediately comes to mind when I think of a successful cloner spawner. Recently, they have completely copied messaging and communication platforms like Slack, and they packaged that up into their own Microsoft Teams product. In the past, they cloned a spreadsheet software called Lotus, which they then turned into the now ubiquitous Excel. They copied the iPad and released their own Surface tablet, and I would even argue that they cloned Sony's PlayStation when they released the Xbox. As we can see, Microsoft doesn't have to have too many original ideas to be a successful company. Next up are non-adjacent spawners. These are a little more complicated, but this type of spawner will buy up or start a new business in a completely unrelated area to the core competency of the parent company. These companies usually have a very high-performing, or even genius level management. I think these are pretty difficult to identify. Pabrai gives the example of BYD, which is a Chinese electric car manufacturer, and at the height of the pandemic, they went into the N95 mask production business. Obviously, the PPE production business is completely different from the car business. Some other more obvious examples would be Amazon Web Services or the Google Cloud, which are both cloud computing platforms by Amazon and Google. These cloud services are completely different from the core business of online retailing or advertising. And finally, we have the Apex spawners. Apex spawners are the head honchos of this framework. These are the result of a Lollapalooza combination of all four of the previously mentioned spawner types. Spawners in general are rare, but Apex spawners are even more rare. Ideally, we want to invest in these Apex spawners because they simply have more opportunities to grow than a company that is only in one category of spawner. They use all the tools in the spawner toolbox. Some of the more prominent examples that Pabrai gives are Amazon, Google, Berkshire Hathaway, and Alibaba. Let me know in the comments below if you've identified any spawners that I surely missed in the previous examples. My goal is to try to collect a pool of these spawners in order to learn from them. Upon hearing about this concept of spawners, there are probably plenty of ideas popping into your head about spawners that you may have previously identified. For example, let's take Amazon, Alibaba, and Google. We know these are great businesses and they've been great investments, and they're obviously Apex spawners, but they're already so massive. In hindsight, it's easy to identify these wildly successful spawners. But my question is, do they offer the best investment opportunity at their current size and price? There's probably a more profitable way to approach these spawners. So for us, the trick is identifying these spawners before they get too large. Okay, with all that said, let's go over Pabrai's rules for investing in spawners. Rule number 1. Assume that no business that you invest in will ever exceed a $50 billion market cap. Something like 9 businesses that have gone public in the past 20 years have ever exceeded a market cap of $100 billion. So let's just assume that we'll never get there. Already we see that we're building in a margin of safety here. So if you want to make 10x your money, you need to invest in a company that's no larger than $5 billion. And if you want to capture a 100 bagger, then you need to limit your investment to companies with a $500 million market cap or less. Number 2. It's mandatory that you study the history of the business and the track record of the capital allocator at the helm. We can find Graham-style stocks by running quantitative screens on price-to-earnings ratios or price-to-book ratios, but there's nothing really equivalent for spawners. The closest thing we can do is maybe screen for return on invested capital, which some people believe is a decent proxy for the capital allocation skills of the management, but it really doesn't show the whole picture. Either way, there's no good alternative to simply reading about the company. I'm assuming we can gather all the information we need by reading publicly available annual reports and other publications about our company to investigate their spawner DNA. For example, we could probably pull together all of Amazon's publicly available annual reports, read them sequentially, and spot patterns about different ventures and acquisitions that make its spawner DNA pretty obvious. Pabrai suggests that we can understand the spawner DNA of a company within 5 to 10 years. He's currently looking at a Japanese company, which he did not name in the video, that has 30 years of spawner history. I'm pretty excited to know what that company is, so let me know if you figure it out. But it should be obvious within 5 or 10 years of their history to figure out if they're a spawner or not. And if it's not obvious, we can simply move to a different opportunity. So to summarize a few concrete rules, we're looking for companies with a market cap no larger than $5 billion and preferably closer to $500 million, depending on whether or not you're looking for a 10x or a 100x. Additionally, we want a company that has obvious spawner DNA and a great capital allocator at the helm. Sounds pretty easy, right? The path of least resistance is often the wisest one to take. If we aren't able to or confident enough to identify spawners, then let's let Mohnish find them for us. One approach we can take is to simply track Pabrai's investment portfolio for the coming quarters and years. He has said publicly many times that he is transitioning his portfolio from 50-cent dollars to long-term compounding spawners. From there, we can investigate the companies in his portfolio and try to figure out how these companies fit into the spawner framework. Then, if we understand the merit of these spawner businesses, we can simply clone him and invest in those businesses ourselves. Or we can use the lessons we learned from investigating his portfolio to try to help us find spawners on our own. Once we've identified a great spawner, Pabrai says that the mantra should be set it and forget it. and that we should only exit our positions if it's clear that there is a secular decline in the company's business. My biggest hesitation with the spawner framework is that it's not clear to me whether or not the spawner framework falls prey to hindsight bias. Of course, Google, Amazon, and Facebook are such obvious spawners that the ideas basically slap you in the face. But who knows? Perhaps this spawner framework will help us identify the next Google with ample time so we can still capture outstanding returns in the business. Since you made it this far, if you like this video, you should probably check out my video over here about Mohnish Pabrai's new investment philosophy, which has to do with long-term compounders and spawners. Please subscribe to the channel if you found the information in this video helpful. I really appreciate you watching this all the way to the end. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time.